And we're probably not going to be cheering so much for some of them, because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong.
But I'd be on that phone call every single day. I'd be up that guy's yin-yang so far with a firecracker he wouldn't know what hit him from Pfizer. I'd be outside that guy's house. Every time he moved, I'd be saying, where's our vaccines?
Change has come to Georgia. Yeah. Change is coming to America.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the LeanTossup podcast. Today, we are joined by Bryan Burgett. How are you doing today, Bryan?
I'm good. Thanks, Robert. Thanks for having me today.
This week, we're going to talk about Canada federally, how the vaccine rollout is affecting Justin Trudeau in the polls, and also how that's affecting other opposition parties, how the Conservatives are doing, how they're angling themselves in this kind of very likely upcoming COVID pandemic election. We're also going to look at provincial numbers, how our premiers such as Doug Ford and John Horgan holding on to their COVID approval ratings, and what do they need to do to hold those going forward. And also, we're going to finally end a little bit on France. We're going to talk about the upcoming French presidential election in 2022 and how Macron is doing it polling-wise, and if he actually is under threat from a more populist wing of the party, a more populist wing of France in terms of Marine Le Pen. Okay, so today I think we're going to kind of start off with Canada. So obviously we've had a lot of recent polling in Canada. Obviously, the big issue of the day in Canada, at least, is the procurement of vaccines. Currently, Canada has been lagging behind internationally definitely compared to the U.S. and to the U.K. in terms of vaccine procurement, and we've definitely been seeing some effect of that in the federal polling. Curtis, can you give us a quick review of what we've been seeing in the national polling and some of the provincial level numbers we've been seeing recently?
So, things haven't changed all that dramatically. Comparative to where we were in about May-ish of last year when the Liberals were up in the 40s. Things are a little bit closer now, but the Liberals are still have a fair lead. The Conservatives are sitting around the 30% marks, somewhere around 31, 29 in there. The only real movement that we've seen as of lately, and it differs on the type of polling that you look at, is the NDP numbers. They're kind of anywhere between like 13 and 23%. And that varies drastically if you're looking at online polling. The online polling tends to have them up towards, the low 20s. And the IVR polling, for example, has them, the mid-teens. So things are not changing as of lately. They've been pretty stable over the past 6-ish months.
So in that case, you would say that the impact of Canada not being able to vaccinate its population at the rate of the UK or the US has actually not had that big of an impact. Although a lot of news and web pages and articles have been spilled about it, currently not showing up a ton in the polling.
As of right now, doesn't really seem to be having a huge impact. You would expect that the Liberals would be, dipping a lot closer to the Conservative numbers if that was the case. But, they've held relatively steady. And, again, depending on who you're looking at pollster-wise, the Liberals could be, anywhere with like an 8-point lead or, a 2-point lead. So, point is, they're still ahead and they still have enough room to work with, even despite the vaccine procurement issue.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Bryan, now obviously you're noticing the polls and you've commented them quite a lot on Twitter. What's your read on the situation? Do you agree with the assessment that the lack of vaccine procurement is not really hurting Trudeau? It's kind of leveling him off. Do you agree with that assessment? Do you think maybe there's some more danger down the road? What do you think?
Yeah, I think we have seen a negative trend, right, for the Liberals, if you really look since like the peak of June 2020. So, but I would agree with Curtis. We would have expected this trend to maybe accentuate with the vaccine or controversy, right, or all the stories about this, and we really haven't. There was maybe one or two polls at some point where we're like, oh, something is happening. But right after this, we got other polls showing that the liberals were very stable. So I'm not saying nothing is happening. It's possible that without the vaccine, the liberals would be back at 39, 40%. But it's really what is puzzling to me is betting on the vaccine and a slow rollout of the vaccine it's pretty much the only thing Erin O'Toole and the conservative had in December, right? They really decided to go all in on criticizing this government for the vaccine. And for once, they kind of got lucky, right? For once, the news network and everything in the news, it was going their way. And so you would think that would be good for them. And somehow it hasn't been. And so is it because of other stories? Is it because people don't like Erin O'Toole? If I were them, I would be quite worried with the fact that right now, in the middle of us being 56 or 57 in the world, and you still cannot get anywhere close, right? I think I said it once on Twitter or a few times. How come we haven't seen a single poll showing the conservative ahead, right? Even with the margin of error, you would think that we would have seen one poll at some point where it would have been 34, 33 for the conservative. And so, but we haven't. Literally, the best we've seen is, they're just at 33 and they're only down by 3, and they would be winning as many seats as 2 years ago. So that's the best case scenario right now, and it's really not what they want to be.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really good point there. I mean, my personal opinion on it, and I literally think it's crazy that, like, I mean, again, we had a federal election just 2 years ago, and the conservatives. I mean, you want to call it federally a tie? Sure, fine. I mean, conservatives won the popular vote, but basically a tie. We aren't even at that. We're not even like again like even if there's a poll like conservatives up one, liberals up one, I'd be like fine, whatever, that's a tie. But like we're not even at that level. There's still a liberal gap, and the fact that we're like and again the liberals won the election, they won more seats. Conservatives won the popular vote, didn't have enough seats to govern at that point. But still, though, we're still not even at that level of support, even when, as again, you said it, right? The conservatives attacked the liberal government on procurement of the vaccines. They got lucky in the fact that Canada can't produce our own domestically. We have to buy them from foreign countries, and then that those foreign countries either through having delays in their own production or basically other countries basically kind of hoarding them, keeping them for themselves, we weren't able to get that level. So you're right, like the conservatives really had a political gift here, the fact that they got to say government's not doing enough to procure the vaccines aren't coming in a big enough number, and then like cool, we got this. And they're not getting anything, they're still down. And I mean, our most recent projection, I believe we released it on. Well, we were recording this on Wednesday night. I believe we released it yesterday, and I think we have the Liberals like 3 seats shy, so like plus 5 seats or so, give or take. Again, that's a pretty rough range there. That's basically the same as 2019, but even then, that's still insane. That this is basically the Conservatives' best talking point, and this is kind of if this is the best they could do, that is that is not necessarily good long term. So let's kind of dig into that a little more. So why, Bryan, why do you specifically think, like you offered a couple of theories, what's personally your theory as to why they're not able to break through with this?
I think it's a combination of multiple effects. I think it's the main one really is we're 7 months into Erin O'Toole's leadership. And honestly, if you ask me today if I can name one policy he would implement, I can't. I really don't think I can mention a single thing he would implement. All I know is he hates China, he was in the military, and he thinks we should have more vaccine and we should have done better last year, whatever that means. So I think at some point, it's one thing to always criticize, but at some point people, and I really believe a lot of people, especially the center right, they would be willing to not vote for Trudeau right now. Trudeau isn't that popular compared to other premier. He got help with COVID, right, as everybody, all the incumbents. But I really think at some point they need to stop just saying, hi, I'm Erin O'Toole and I was in the military. And you need to start suggesting what exactly would you do? Would you reform EI? Would you do this? I know my guess is they're thinking that people don't want to listen to policies right now. But at some point, you're going to have to suggest something, right? And we even got a report yesterday that even the caucus doesn't know where they're heading. And we're probably 2 months before an election. So I think the main one is really, my theory is they need to stand for something. The other reasons is honestly, they're all over the place, right? Even in terms of overall messaging over the last 6 months. And I think Andrew Coyne today had an editorial about this. when Erin O'Toole won, we thought he had a vision, right? He was like, okay, so I'm gonna go after the populist vote, the working class vote. I'm gonna try to emulate Boris Johnson and Donald Trump without being, an asshole or racist. And I'm just gonna go after this NDP working class vote. And so for like about a month and a half, we're like, okay, that makes sense. At least there is a vision. But then they're gonna fall back on, oh, we're social conservative, and then you hear Pierre Poilievre who keeps talking about the debt all the time. So they don't have a constant messaging. And so I think right now they're alienating everybody. They're turning off center-right voters who are afraid of the social conservative, and they're starting to alienate the actual base. I mean, when you look at the polls, when you look at the satisfaction numbers, it's not good. I mean, they're losing a lot in the prairies. They're losing a lot in Alberta. I mean, there is an actual genuine risk that they're losing some of their base right now. So they're upsetting everybody, and they're not making anyone happy.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, right? I mean, in terms of the Conservatives attacking and trying to go after NDP base, there is some kind of soft voters that they could get there, right? I mean, especially looking at Southern Ontario. Again, there's a lot of NDP working class voters, London, Hamilton, Niagara, my riding, Niagara Centre, right? There's a lot of soft underbelly. Like as a fun thing last year for our model, but in 2019, sorry, when we basically had the Conservatives getting to a majority, like our majority seat was like Hamilton was one of the Hamiltons. I can't remember which one it is. Like they need that seat to get to a majority. Like those are the seats they need, and it's a smart strategy to go after those. But yeah, like at this point, their messaging just seems to be like, we don't like China. He was in the military, and like we should have more vaccines somehow. Like that's not really a comprehensive set of policy goals. You are right that they are kind of losing some ground in the prairies, which is definitely concerning. But I don't really see that as a huge deal outside of, say, your urban seats in, say, Calgary or Edmonton. I don't really think they're going to lose much of the rural vote to the Liberals, at least. But then at that point, then, and again, as you quoted Andrew Coyne in the caucus was saying that they don't know what the policy is. If they start adapting some kind of some more centrist policies, then they start running a risk of having like Wexit Party or Bernier coming in and stealing some of those voters. Like again, it is very possible that they could just pick off a random rural seat in Alberta or Saskatchewan or something. Like that's a very real possibility. And it's really hard. It's a balancing act that they're trying to play where they're trying to appease those voters, and I suspect that's kind of what the tough on China is. But then at the same time, it's hard to appeal to the other voters that you need to get to that majority. And I really do feel that they are floundering. And I think the pandemic's given them a lot of kind of really kind of easy soft targets they could try to hit, and it hasn't produced the results they wanted. Let's get Alex into this here too. So Alex, we talked. Curtis before was saying about the NDP and how they're kind of oscillating between. I believe it's kind of like hot low mid 20s to kind of low mid teens. How do you see the NDP as working through this pandemic? Like how do you think they're making like doing politically well with the result of the pandemic, like in terms of how they're attacking the Trudeau government? Do you think they're doing a bad job? Are they presenting coherent policy? What's your opinion on that?
My impression of the NDP is that they're holding the line right now, but I don't really know if they have that much to actually run on, and I'm pretty skeptical about any new polling that's giving them a surge out of nowhere, or that they could somehow be cleaning up among blue collar, blue orange swing voters. Like I heard a lot about the pharmacare vote that they forced, but the final results there just seem kind of humiliating. They're doing okay. Yesterday I think they have a pretty good recruit in Edmonton Griesbach. They found a young Indigenous politician of some stature to run in that stretch riding. So they're putting together a slate, but I don't think the earth is going to be moving for them, and I'm really skeptical about this nebulous polling high we're seeing right now. It will take a lot more to convince me that anything big is changing in this country.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Curtis, earlier you had kind of adding on to that point. You had talked a bit about how the NDP vote seems to shift and change based on kind of polling methodology, and we actually do really see that a lot. Generally, before a campaign, we kind of see a somewhat inflated NDP vote. Obviously, of course, it depends on what happens in that campaign, right? Obviously, if the Liberals have a really bad election, and again, this is either federally or provincially in many provinces, obviously that NDP vote will either crystallize and go up, or if the Liberals are doing well, then the NDP vote will go down. What do you kind of feel is the more accurate sense of the NDP? Where do you kind of put them? Do you think that they are kind of in that higher 20s, in those teens? Where do you view their support, and where do you see them competing on the board in the probably upcoming federal election?
Um, I would say that it kind of depends on what your view is on the vaccine rollout, would be my argument. If you're of the opinion that, the liberals are being harmed to some degree by the vaccine rollout, then the increase in the NDP numbers makes sense because a lot of people aren't going to be switching to the conservatives right now because, as Brian was explaining earlier, they're kind of, all over the goddamn place and they're not doing all that fantastic. So if that's the case, I could see the fact of the NDP numbers being in like the high teens, low 20s. But if it's the fact that the liberals are doing well with with the COVID vaccine rollout and people are satisfied with the liberals, then the idea that the NDP is in the mid-teens, roughly in and around where they finished the last election at around 15, 16%, I mean, that one makes more sense. But because we have such a weird divergence in the polls, it's hard to kind of pinpoint which one is which. If you're a fan of the IVR polls and the telephone polls, you'll believe the lower numbers for the NDP, and if you're more of a fan of the online polls and believe they're right, then you're going to believe that the NDP is doing much better. I mean, I do have to agree with Alex on the point that I'm a little skeptical when it comes to polls that have like the NDP pop it off out of nowhere. Like the most recent Leger poll that we had, the one thing that really drove the NDP numbers up in that poll was the fact that they were now at like 40% in British Columbia, which, you know, it's not impossible, but it's probably unlikely at the moment. So, it's we would have to see what happens in an election season because as you said, like it either crystallizes or it fades away. But I mean, like I don't know, if you're comparing it to elections past, I would rather be the NDP going into a new election than going into the previous election when they were like tied with slash behind the Greens at some point. So at least they're doing like fine, relatively speaking.
Okay, so let's kind of shift here. We've been talking a lot about the federal polling and where things sit federally in terms of seats and opinion polling. Let's kind of go down on the provincial level. So obviously Trudeau, as we talked about, he was obviously the beneficiary of a pretty large COVID bounce, as many other leaders around the world were. Obviously Boris Johnson, etc. Donald Trump was to an extent kind of faded, but apparently came back there at the end. So, looking at the provincial level, though, we're seeing a lot of the premiers enjoying sizable COVID bounces as well. Uh, Newfoundland, whenever that election actually happens, apparently seems poised to elect a massive Liberal majority, again, retaining an incumbent government. BC had an election; they re-elected their premier to a majority. Ontario, although not technically scheduled to have an election until June of 2022, I personally don't buy that. Doug Ford has his highest approval, like his highest polling numbers since basically the last election. I don't think he's going to wait that long. I think we're going to see something a lot sooner. I think probably if there's a federal election and that kind of settles down, I suspect he'll probably go a little earlier. It just makes too much political sense, I think, personally. But
it doesn't take too much of an excuse because remember, Brian Pallister held the Manitoba election a year early because he claimed that it would interfere with the province's 150th anniversary celebrations.
I think Ontario's past 150 though, but we could be like, oh, you can't mess with 153rd celebration. So, but no, I mean honestly though, like, and the thing is, it's a good point that he went a year early, didn't have much of a consequence. We're getting to that point where it's just less than a year. Right, like we're looking at like we're in March right now, like 3 months from now we're in June. March, Yeah, okay, 4 months we're in June, and then that's within a year, right? So like we're very close to that point where he could potentially, if the Feds go in the summer, he could potentially look at a spring election and just be like, yeah, we're just getting it done now, or like a fall election, sorry, and getting it done, especially if most of Ontario is vaccinated. Just kind of looking at the polling for Ford in Ontario here. Last election, he won 40.5% of the vote, just shy of 41. To the NDP's 33.56. Basically, if you look at the polling now, the most recent poll, Main Street Research poll from I think 2 weeks ago, it had Ford at 43%, the NDP at 22%, the Liberals at 25%. That's obviously massive splitting there on the left. The most, like, last time I saw numbers like that was actually basically, well, we've seen a couple numbers like that during the pandemic, but the last time we saw numbers like that in pre-pandemic polls was right before the last Ontario election, where there was kind of this competition between the Liberals and the NDP to figure out who was going to be the one to take on Ford. Obviously, the NDP won that with Horvath. Kathleen Wynne faded away, and then that's how the NDP got up to 33. So we're definitely seeing Ford up functionally 2 points from his 2018 election, and then basically an NDP and Liberal split. Kind of going over to BC, there's an Angus Reid poll from November. Don't really think that's particularly relevant at this exact moment because it's still from November. Obviously, a lot of things have happened since November, but basically showing the same as that. And again, there's the very interesting point that although Trudeau's COVID bounce has seemed like he had a massive lead early on in the COVID pandemic, that's faded a bit, but he still does have a lead. It's very interesting and telling that Ford's lead and Horgan's lead have obviously not faded. Those are still rock solid and they're still there. Brian, why do you think that Ford, at least particularly Ford, we'll focus more on Ford rather than Horgan for a second here. Why do you think Ford's opinion, like polling, is still rock solid and he's actually gained a couple of points since his last election in 2018?
I don't know, honestly, I wish I had a good explanation, but to me, like the two really weird numbers we see in Canadian politics right now, yeah, it's for Doug Ford and François Legault in Quebec. I do not understand why they're still so popular. You would think that given, especially in Quebec, where they have the worst number of the pandemic, you would think that exactly some of their bonds would have, decreased by now the same way that Trudeau or Trump. So it's surprising. I would like to mention that if when I was doing like easy calculations or quick calculations of like how much bonds there was and how much there is remaining. I remember I wasn't super systematic, I pretty much eyeballed it. And I remember that for Doug Ford, his bonds came later. So maybe that has to do as well. He didn't get it as early as Trudeau. Trudeau, it's really like March, April, all of a sudden he ended up at 42%. But when I had to find the peak for Doug Ford, it was about 2 months later. So it took longer for him to go up. But he hasn't gone down. It really seems to me that when we see everywhere across the world, is as long as the leader is doing or looks like he cares, right? It's really all it seems to matters. Do you care, or are you an asshole? Are you an asshole like Donald Trump or like Jason Kenney, right? Do you look like you don't care about death? Do you look like you're not trying to do your best? And after this, it doesn't matter if you do your best or not. I mean, there are really many reasons to attack Doug Ford and François Legault, but as long as they look at those nice populist guys who are trying their best, somehow you're not going down. So, and we see it in BC as well. I'm linking. It's like there are many voters who right now really I don't think care about much, and they're like, I'm okay with the one we have right now. He's doing his best. I'm gonna vote for him. End of story. I mean, I don't care about any other politics, any other policies, any other issues.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I would also point out that in the UK, obviously, Boris Johnson's bounce
Yeah.
definitely receded,
Yeah.
kind of more towards the summer. That definitely crashed, but we're starting to see that come back now, right? I mean, go back a couple months, it was not hard to find polls with Labour and the Conservatives and the Tories in the UK tied. Now that gap is 4 or 5 points, right? Surprisingly enough, also, when you're looking at the SNP in Scotland and the independence vote, that also seems to have come down a bit. Very possible that being able to very quickly produce like a vast amount of vaccines makes people a little less want to leave the country in
Yeah.
terms of independence. But I think this is kind of that, right? Like basically, they had struggled with the pandemic early on and kind of containing it. And then all of a sudden we get to the vaccine rollout, and obviously because the UK has a lot of domestic producers of vaccine, they are able to mass produce it pretty quickly, got it to the people. I think the UK has the best, or this one of the top, I believe, for in terms of largest per capita country. I believe they're actually one of the best in terms of vaccine rollout. So that's definitely helping um, Boris Johnson there. And I think that's kind of interesting to look at here. I think part of it does play into, especially for Ontario, I honestly feel like people just aren't really thinking about what they feel about Ontario provincially. I think that does play into it, right? Like looking at this number, it doesn't, like, obviously this number doesn't exist, right? Obviously this like 40 something, 20 something, 20 something, that's not going to happen. We know that's not going to happen on election day. Something is going to change. Even if Ford stays the same, which I doubt, there's going to be some massive change between the Liberal and the NDP, right? But it just, something about this, it just seems like maybe people are more focused on the federal politics, and they're not necessarily they're not really thinking about their provincial vote intention. Like Ford's been okay, maybe they'll evaluate it kind of later. But again, Ford did a pretty good job early on, kind of got away from him there with the second round of lockdowns they had to do around Christmas time. Um, we've kind of gotten out of lockdown a little early. I think we definitely could be looking at a surge in cases in the immediate future. We'll have to see how lockdown part 3, if that happens in Ontario, how that affects it. But yeah, I think it is kind of really puzzling of how just still strong Ford is in terms of the polling. And that's definitely something to keep an eye on, especially when we get Ontario polls, to see if that number does go down or not. Now, in terms of BC, they were the very quick early leader in Canada in terms of stopping the spread of COVID in BC. They just crushing it. They were doing absolutely amazing. Called the election, got an amazing mandate to govern. That was great. Now they're kind of falling a bit behind. Bryan, you're obviously BC's your home province. Why don't you talk a little bit about kind of what's happened and how BC is kind of fallen behind in terms of how well they were doing earlier?
Yeah, it really makes you wonder if, how much of the early response was just being lucky, right? I mean, and how much of it was really us being so good. I think it was pretty much back to earth on the second wave when we discovered we were not like that special in the world, and we did have to lock down, albeit, differently from the rest of Canada. But, we haven't been able to see friends or anybody indoors since, mid-November, right? I mean, so sure, our restaurants and gyms and stores are open, but we haven't had any social gathering privately for 4 months now, pretty much. So we, it's not like we're doing that much better than the rest of Canada in terms of cases. I think right now, if he hadn't gone in election in October, John Horgan, yeah, I would be a little bit more skeptical he would be winning a majority right now. I think he would still be winning a majority, especially against Andrew Wilkinson, because Wilkinson was so bad as a leader. But I would expect the mandate to be less crushing than what he got. He timed it really pretty perfectly, right? He went between the two waves when we still looked like we were so good, and when we didn't want to talk about anything else. I mean, it's literally a month of, Andrew Wilkinson trying to talk about something else and nobody paying attention, right? I joke about this the other day, but John Horgan didn't even run that good of a campaign, right? I mean, at some point, one of his big promises was, "Oh, we're gonna give you the COVID vaccine for free," and we're like, "Yeah, of course it's gonna be free. Like, what are you talking about? Like, that's one of your big promises today." It was just like it's one of the most cruising victory I've ever seen. So would it get it today? I'm not sure. I mean, if we didn't have an election like 4 months ago, I think it would be a slightly different story, and there would be a lot more ammunition to attack this government. But he has his mandate, and the opposition doesn't exist right now. So I'm pretty sure if we were to get any poll right now, I would be surprised if the NDP wasn't close to 50% at the very least, because, well, who else are you going to vote for? I mean, the Liberals, they barely exist at this point. So.
Yeah. All right. So let's bring in kind of Alex and Curtis here. Alex, we'll go to you first here. What do you think about these premier kind of COVID bounces, right? Do you think that they have, like, are these going to last pretty long? Do you think they have legs outside of the pandemic? Like, once everybody's fully vaccinated, do we just go back to politics as normal and talk about tax cuts and stuff? Like, what do you think?
This is one reason I'm so impatient waiting for Newfoundland's results to come in, because right now our 3 pandemic elections in Canada have all been success stories, as Bryan was talking about. New Brunswick had the Atlantic bubble. BC had a nice trough between the two waves. Saskatchewan also happened to go to the polls at the time when it was, I think, the province with the least cases in the country outside the Atlantic. So three provinces that picked pretty good times to hold an election, three incumbents that were rewarded. Newfoundland is going to be super interesting because finally we have a pandemic election that's gone completely off the rails, and we're going to see if that actually is something that people care about or not. So if people are actually rewarding premiers for their competence and their performance, or if they're just lining up behind the incumbent because it's a global crisis and people are scared, worried, and not really tuned into what the legislature is busying itself with, that's what we're going to get to see as soon as those freaking mail votes arrive in 1.5 weeks or whenever they're scheduled for.
Yeah,
I think it's good. It's going to be an excellent contrast. We're gonna learn a lot more.
Do you think Trudeau is waiting on those results to decide? Because that the federal election would be a good test, right? As well. I mean, we would get a prime minister that is ahead, but is nowhere remotely as popular as the three that were successful. So do you think, because we know John Horgan waited for the New Brunswick election, right? He saw what happened. It was like, boom, we're going in election, right? And for sure. But so do you think Trudeau is looking at Newfoundland and waiting to see if he should go?
Absolutely. Yeah. If the Newfoundland Liberals take home anything short of a stonking, brutal majority, I think, well, we're not going to have a summer federal election in Canada.
I do kind of think Trudeau is looking at the results, obviously. I mean, Newfoundland and the Atlantic in general, obviously pretty big bastions of Liberal support. You need those ridings to win federally if you're a Liberal. Those are really important pieces to have. I think there is a piece of it, though, where I think he needs to wait a little longer. I mean, obviously, the vaccine procurement's starting to ramp up. I think we're getting more and more doses, obviously, and then as the U.S. gets closer to being fully vaccinated, obviously more doses will start to become available in Canada, right? I mean, obviously, at this point, I think Joe Biden just announced today that I believe they're going to have enough doses for pretty much everybody by May. Um, Obviously, whenever I hear a number like that, whenever I say, oh, so many, like everybody will have doses, be able to be vaccinated by this date, always take the date less than that, because what happens is not everybody's going to get vaccinated, right? I mean, at this point, obviously, we're vaccinating people who are older. We're vaccinating people who are 65 plus, people who are much more vulnerable to the virus. Those people are going to be taking it at a much higher rate. Once we start getting to people in their 40s, 50s, 30s, they're not going to be they're not going to have that same number of vaccination numbers, right? So it's going to make more vaccines available. We're going to get to the lower stages earlier, and I think that's going to, it's like, obviously, whenever they say a date, kind of always assume less, but also once the U.S. basically hits a saturation point for vaccines, Biden's just going to let the companies loose, right? They're making millions of these vaccine doses a week. The U.S. isn't going to keep hoarding them after everybody's vaccinated. Those are going to start going to Canada, Mexico. They're going to export them across the world, right? So, and I mean, again, like if Canada gets 2 million doses from the U.S. a week, what, 10 weeks? That's the entire country. Like, that's barely anything, right? Even less time, people are starting to get vaccinated, right? So, like, obviously, at a certain point, I think Trudeau needs to wait a little bit more until enough people are vaccinated, or we really get a really firm date for when people will be starting to get vaccinated. And I think he goes. I don't see any issues with that at all. I'm fairly sure if they do well in Newfoundland, if Liberals do well in Newfoundland, I'm fairly sure he's eyeing a date, probably early fall, maybe summer, early fall, depending on how quickly we can get some U.S. Vaccine doses. Kind of back to the topic of provincial premiers, though, and getting Curtis in here. I'll come to you specifically in Ontario. Do you think that these kind of forward bounces, like this forward approval, is permanent? Is there a way you think he can hold it? Like, what do you think Ford should do going forward if he wants to hold this COVID bounce?
Not do what he was doing before the pandemic, that's for certain. I mean, for Doug Ford as a premier, this pandemic has been like an absolute lifeline for him, to be quite honest, because prior to this, he I mean, he was in hot fucking water to say the least. His government kind of bumbled a hell of a lot of cases, and polling prior to the pandemic had the liberals like way ahead of the incumbent conservatives. But then you saw the pandemic kick off, and although it was a little bit delayed, the polling did eventually show Doug Ford with, like a fair margin, like 20, 25% or more of a lead over whatever party was behind him, liberal or NDP. So, I mean, I don't know, if I was the Doug Ford government, once the pandemic is over, they need to make sure that they're watching themselves very closely for the next, year and a half or so, because if they allow for things to go back to the way they were being ran prior to the pandemic, his party support is going to dry up again, and people are going to be like, "Oh, right, that's why we did like the Ford conservatives prior to the pandemic."
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. I think one of the important things to kind of think about is what does, because when you look at this in terms of just kind of the numbers, right? Ford got 40%. He's at 43% right now. Again, in 2019, I'm just trying to find the number here. I think what did Scheer get in Ontario in 2019? I'm just trying to find that number here. He got about 30. He got about the national, right? I think he got like 33% in the national, I think. Let me just check that.
Well, it's now of course it's Kenny who's going to be the liability during the next federal election.
Yeah, weird how that works. It goes from Doug Ford, please don't say anything, to Jason Kenney, please don't say anything.
Please stay in your basement in Calgary.
Which is going to be a little bit funny, given the fact that, if I'm remembering correctly, Jason Kenney was like very vocally out there supporting Aaron O'Toole during the leadership. So it's going to be a little bit harder for him to
so proud of
distance.
this.
Yes, yeah. So that's the thing, right? So so I just checked it now. Scheer got 33.1% in Ontario. So there's roughly about 10% of Ontario. If assume that every conservative who voted federally voted provincially, which is relatively not a completely fair assumption, but relatively fair. It's about a 10% chunk of Ontario. That's like a Trudeau in like 2019, probably Trudeau in 2019, Trudeau in 2015. Sorry, Trudeau Trudeau voter right now. That is kind of insane, but what does that person want from Ford? What, like, obviously a large part of them probably were like, we hate Wynne for corruption, but like what does Ford do to hold that voter, I think, is kind of the important question going through. Bryan, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, my suspicion is a lot of those people are in the 905, right? If there's one thing Doug Ford is kind of the only right-wing leader right now in Canada that is, well, outside of First World ago, right? But that is good in urban area in the suburb, right? I mean, so this is where the federal conservative really would benefit from somebody like Doug Ford. So I don't know if those voters really want something, I would be willing to bet that if you actually drill them on specific policies right now, they would realize that they don't want Doug Ford to be reelected next time. But as long as they don't think in terms of policies and they just think in terms of personalities, maybe, then they would be fine to go with him, right? So it might be like some sort of like blissful ignorance of the actual issues, because I would be quite surprised if we really go and we narrow it down and we establish their ideologies and what policies they would want. I don't think those voters would still vote for Doug Ford next time.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think those voters are kind of just like, yeah, like, I like Trudeau, but like, I want to I'd rather go like a barbecue with Doug Ford, I think is probably that's like the perfect example of what it is, like a barbecue in Mississauga or something. So anyways, so let's move on from Canada here. Let's get into our kind of final topic here. We're going to talk about the French presidential election for 2022. Now, obviously, as is typical in France, Macron is underwater in approval ratings. This is typical for pretty much all French presidents after they are elected. Most recent polls kind of show, basically, in terms of the first round, they show kind of a tie between Macron and Le Pen, again within a point or two, which is actually a carbon copy of where they were after the first round in 2017. But the difference now, though, is that the second round polling. Again, in 2017, Macron won the second round, which is also known as a runoff. He won the runoff between him and Le Pen, who was a far-right leader. He won that by 33 points, right? He went 63-33, right, by 2/3. Now that's within 10 points. So, Bryan, obviously, I'll go to you on this. Why do you think there is such a huge difference now? What is this? Is this a real difference? Is this people just not thinking about who? Is it people just being like, yeah, I don't like Macron, but I'll come back to him eventually. What do you kind of think is happening here?
So I think it's the result of two things, right? The first one is there is a long-term trend, right? And I'm older, I think, than most of you here, and I learned politics by following like the 2002 French election, right? Which was like, I would say there are two events in my life that I thought were shocking. It's 2002 in France when Jean-Marie Le Pen made it to the runoff, and it's 2016 when Donald Trump won the U.S. federal election. I mean, really, I would remember those two nights. I was completely shocked watching this. So I think we have seen over the last 2-3 decades a slow rise but constant rise of the Rassemblement National, right, but of the Le Pen party. And so they went from being fringe to being competitive to being guaranteed to be in the second round. And so in particular, what we see is more and more they're able to eat the right, because just 20 years ago it was unthinkable for somebody that was from the center right, from they always change name, right? What we call the Républicains right now, but it used to be l'UMP and other parties. So it used to be unthinkable for those guys to vote for Le Pen in the second round. They're like, no, we don't want the Nazis, we don't want the fascists, whoever is in the second round against them, we're gonna vote for them. But we see more and more, and it really switched around in 2017. We see that now it's almost 50-50 almost among the center right, where they're like, no, actually, we would most likely rather vote for the Le Pen or Marine Le Pen, especially Marine Le Pen, who has done a really good job making her party look, or at least look, more centrist. So this is the long-term trend. The most recent trend, and that is causing really this close race in the runoff, is people are not happy with Emmanuel Macron, but people are never happy with their president in France. But we see really a lot of people in the left that are really, really unhappy with him. And when I watch the news in France, I see more and more people who are like, why would I vote for Macron next time? Because anyway, all he does is he governs like a right-wing guy, and I don't even see the difference between his policies and Marine Le Pen. And we've seen really, I think, Robert, you commented on like this video right on Twitter, where we had like the Minister of Security of France, like the Interior Minister, who was attacking Marine Le Pen for not hating Muslims enough, right? They were like, oh, you're soft on Muslims or on Islam. And you're like, wow, this is crazy. And so we see more and more people in the left who are like, well, you know what? If there is a second round, I don't know who I'm going to vote for, and I might just stay home because I couldn't care less.
I wanted to make comment about that, because when I first came across that video, it was absolutely insane to me, because like, you watch the video and Marine Le Pen looks visibly shocked that she's like, how am I the least bigoted person on this stage right now? She's like, I've been sitting here shitting on Muslims and gay people and anyone who's not like the archetypical like family unit of France, effectively. And it was just like, I made this comment to people where I said, like, Macron is trying to do that because he's trying to bring people in to outflank effectively fascists in France from the right. But all that's going to do is either pull his party to the right or make Le Pen's party look more reasonable.
Yeah.
And he loses both ways. And I don't see how that works in any potential way, because it's just going to backfire. But I mean, I don't know. I'm not anybody who lives in France. I don't know what the opinion is there on the ground, but like it just seems like really bad optics to me.
Well, I think it works, or it could work for him, because I think maybe his bet is there is, he already got the vote of the center left, which really doesn't exist anymore, right? The Parti Socialiste. And so he's thinking like the rest of the left might not vote for him anyway. He has to secure the right-wing vote, right, at this point. And as long as he makes it to the second round, to the runoff, he probably thinks that he wins anyway, right? So the only risk for him to not win re-election is to not make it to the second round. So
I wonder if it would be a situation where he makes it to the second round, and so does Le Pen. But then you have what would be typically like that kind of center-left base that he won with the first round, if they look at those two and just kind of go, maybe, like as you said, maybe they just stay home, right? Maybe they don't turn out, and like that's enough to pull him behind in a second round vote.
Yeah, the left doesn't show up. And as I said, I think he's really worried about the center right. We really see more and more that the center right is now so divided. And so if he's losing the center right and the center right rallies around Marine Le Pen, then he's done, right? He's literally just done. So he's probably trying to really save this vote. That's my reading of what I've seen recently with him.
Yeah, and I'll comment on something you said there, right? 'Cause you said that a lot of people are like, oh, they said they don't see a difference between Macron and Le Pen, and that reminded me, give me a flashback to 2016, where people are like, oh, like some people in the U.S.,
Yes.
some on the left wing were like, I don't see a difference between Clinton and Trump. They're like the same person, and it's just like, for so many people, were like, that's insane, right? We know there's a clear difference of it, but there are a lot of people who believe that, and to this day still believe that. Now, generally, those people are mostly on the left. But again, that's a pretty sizable base, and if there's enough people like that in France, like I mean, I just remember there's so many tropes about that, and people like who just stayed home, like there's no difference between Clinton and Trump, they're the same, and that is a scary position you're in, and I think if Macron has decided that the right is going to come out and vote, and he has to kind of pander to them, he's going to hurt his left wing base, but it's a very tactical thing, and I think that if you're, and again, I think in many cases Macron kind of suffers from this in kind of the same way as Trudeau, where sometimes he doesn't come off as the most genuine in terms of there's been a lot of Macron Trudeau comparisons in terms of that. So I think I kind of think that's kind of a similarity between Trump versus Clinton in 2016, where if you're basically forced between two people who you think are basically the same, and you kind of think one is more genuine, more approachable, I think you're going to pick the one who is more genuine, more approachable. And I think that is definitely a huge problem for Macron going forward. I think it's also very interesting that the way you phrased it earlier too, when you said that like the most shocking was that the far right got into the runoff several years ago in France. I think it's kind of interesting that you phrased it. This was just kind of an inevitability. You were just like, oh well, they made the runoff for the first time ever, and then they keep making the runoff now, and now you're just kind of, you framed it as kind of this just inevitability path to winning the presidency, and that's a really kind of interesting take on it. And when you look at it in terms of the grand scale, yeah, it actually does make sense that you just see this continual rise, and eventually, although you generally can get a conservative candidate in the top two, it's only a matter of time before that becomes someone who's further right wing, and then eventually that person gets blown out. But then eventually you just gain enough support where that person becomes competitive, and maybe they'll come close. Maybe it'll be 4 or 5%, but then 5 years later they'll finish the job, right? Maybe that's 2022. Who knows? We don't know what's going to happen yet. We don't even know what's going to happen this year, so we'll have to see. But yeah, I think it's really interesting. Alex, we'll kind of get you in here. What do you kind of think about this? Because Bryan kind of drew a very strong line between Trump and Le Pen in France, and obviously there's other lines you can draw on there to Brexit in the UK. What do you kind of think of these right-wing parties across the globe? Do you think that they're all kind of the same and they're all kind of latching onto the same base? Like, do you think that they're kind of fundamentally different in some way?
Well, geez, Robert, I've become much less intelligent since I let my Economist subscription expire, but I can jump into this anyway. No, I was thinking because you just brought up the so-called double haters, the U.S. voters in 2016 who had an extreme dislike of both Trump and Clinton and viewed both of them as equally morally or politically compromised. But I think the most interesting thing about the 2020 U.S. election was that the double haters did not actually all come home as soon as one of the candidates changed to someone who didn't have the same baggage as Hillary. So the conventional wisdom for 4 years was, as soon as there's a matchup between anyone but Trump versus Clinton, 10% of the country, like all the libertarians and the Greens, are all going to settle on whoever the new face is. And the Democrats did just that. They nominated a boring, uncontroversial, well-liked guy. And they did not get their free 10% of the popular vote by doing that. Like Trump performed just as well as last time, despite being up against a vastly more liked person. And
yeah, he almost won. Yeah.
So, and I think that's because so much of the populist right worldwide is watching the U.S. for what to do next. I think that big shocker is the biggest factor that's going to be shaping the strategy of all of these far right parties around the continent. But we're already seeing some shockers, because wasn't it just this month that Salvini in Italy has now entered government, and he's some kind of tree-hugging pro-European now? Did I catch that correctly?
I think you're right, but isn't the new Italian government representing like 90% of the spectrum right now? I think I saw a graph somewhere where they had the record in the world. It's something like 90% of parliament is represented because, they were saying that Switzerland was always the highest one because we have a weird government in Switzerland, but now Italy actually had a higher percentage. So I think you're right. I wouldn't be surprised if their government goes from all the way from the left to the right.
Yeah, I think the interesting comparison you brought up there to 2020 in the U.S. is kind of important to this too, right? Because for 4 years, basically, it was framed, and our podcast framed it as this too, right? That it was basically like, okay, fine, 2020 is basically 2016, except they have someone more popular. And the person who's more popular is going to get more white college voters, more white non-college voters, hold the same with Hispanic and African American voters, and that's it. Election's done. It's a blowout. And some of that happened, but some of that also didn't happen. And it's kind of crazy how, like, the thing is, there was like this well-defined line of what should have happened, right? It's like, okay, fine. Like there's that line, there was that train of thought of what it should have been. There's the other train of thought of, okay, well, the trends are just going to continue. Trump's going to do better in the rural areas. Biden will do better in the suburbs, but he'll hold minority voters. But then that also kind of fell apart too, right? Because you saw, you for the first time, I think pretty much ever, you saw a right-wing party make gains with minority voters. And I mean, obviously, we see that in Canada, right? I mean, we talked about Doug Ford 20 minutes ago, right? Doug Ford obviously definitely won minority voters in Mississauga and Brampton as he swept all the seats in Mississauga, right? So there's obviously a lot of there is some examples of it, but when we're looking at someone who a far right party that's that far right globally kind of making those gains, it's very rare, and it's kind of turned its conventional thinking on its head, and we still like it's so hard to kind of even think forward as to what that's going to look like, right? Like move like in a year, will Le Pen make gains with minority voters in France? Right? Like, is that even possible? What about in the eventual Canadian election? Right? I mean, we saw in the last Canadian federal election some of the closest conservative liberal battles in Toronto were some of actually the high minority ones in kind of outer Toronto ring with high Chinese and Asian populations. Those were actually some of the most competitive conservative liberal battles. The ones that people thought were going to be the competitive ones weren't the competitive ones. It was actually seats like Willowdale. It was actually not competitive. It was still a 20-point functional blowout, but still, that was the more competitive one. Are we going to see that gain? Like these are really important questions that we saw it once in the U.S. and we see kind of the U.S. as a predictor for some of these global trends. We just don't know if that's going to happen again. Bryan, what's your thoughts on that? Do you see minorities as playing a bigger role in right-wing parties going forward, or do you kind of think this was a one-off, really weird aberration that we saw in November in the U.S.?
No, what I think if we focus on Canada, right, and I think who was it, like Daryl Bricker and others have said the same, right? If you look at where our immigration is coming from right now, China, India, there are people who are naturally more conservative, right? So technically, that should be a fertile ground, right, for a center right-wing party. Is it a fertile ground for like really populist, borderline, or truly racist party, or like for people like Trump? I don't know. It's kind of puzzling, right? And I'm not sure if in the States, if we really saw people just going voting, like for instance, I'm thinking of the Hispanic community or the Latino community. I mean, is it really just that they like Trump, or is it that they have a tendency to vote for the incumbent, right? So I mean, we would see. But I remember that was a big debate, a discussion in Canada during the Harper years, right? And in 2011, we thought, oh, that's it, they did it, right? They finally managed to break the stronghold of the Trudeau name over, or the Liberals brand over those minority voters. And going forward, it's never going to go back. And it went back in 4 years, right? So I think it might be more difficult in Canada because our federal conservatives are so ineffective. But at the provincial level, yeah, I would definitely expect a lot of minorities to go and to vote right wing. Like, you know, I don't think they would look for like super strong, like a socially conservative, but something like along the line where you fiscally responsible and you are a little bit socially conservative, you're just not super liberal on this, you're very centrist. I think that would attract a lot of people in the GT and in the GVA, like especially all the new immigrants, definitely. You know, I think COVID and the fact that polls really show that Macron and Le Pen are really likely to make it to the runoff, it really limits, 2017 was a lot more uncertain, right? I mean, there were really, you had like 4 people who could make it, like realistically, right? So I don't think we're gonna see this again. So it might make the first round like a lot less interesting than 5 years ago, 4 years ago. So, and it does limit the permutation in the runoff. And if you just look at it from like you're a political nerd, right, or you're just interested, it's a little bit unfortunate because I keep saying that what I would want as the spectator from outside of France is I would want to see a runoff. My dream would be to have Jean-Luc Mélenchon, right, the far left, versus Marine Le Pen. And because I really have no clue what would happen. Because, every time we've seen the far right in the runoff, they were facing a center-right candidate, right, or a centrist candidate. So all the left rally mostly behind the Republican front. But I would really be curious to see what would happen if it was a true left-wing candidate versus Marine Le Pen. I think it would be close to a 50-50, if not having a slight edge for Marine Le Pen, but I don't think it's likely to happen. Mélenchon is barely at 10%, and the left in France, they're really, really good at splitting the vote, right? I mean, they're just gonna have like 6 parties between like very, very close political orientations, and they pretend to hate each other, a little bit like the NDP and the Green Party in Canada, I guess.
So you would say if you had to make a choice between like a far left and a far right candidate, you'd give the edge to the far right candidate?
Right now, if it was, yes, I think in France, yeah, because I think Marine Le Pen, well, first of all, she would get her 25%, that is like base at this point, and I think she would get most of the center right and center votes. I mean, I think they would rather have Marine Le Pen than a guy that would be, it would just become like or it would be dangerous for the economy and the finance of the nation. And so, yeah, I do think that if that was the runoff, I think Marine Le Pen would win, yes.
That's interesting. And the other interesting fact of that is that in France they have the legislative elections after the presidential elections.
Yes.
And then they have whoever wins the presidential election generally gets a pretty big bump in polling for the legislative elections. So if Le Pen were to win, do you think she'd be able to basically parlay that into a pretty sizable legislative majority, or would there be like a the French version of the U.S. like checks and balances thing?
I think that I would expect some check and balances, and mostly because the electoral system in France is so bad for the far right, right? Because they actually need to win 50% plus 1. And so I mean, again, like 20 years ago, they couldn't win a single seat, right? And now they're winning seats, left and right, but they're still a minority. So I would expect them to get a bump. I would expect them to win a lot more seats if somehow she was to become president. But I do think there would be a call for, hey, let's put some checks and balances on her.
Because the legislative system also has 2 rounds, correct?
Correct. And not only they have 2 rounds, but they have this weird thing where in the runoff, you can have more than 2 candidates. And they have this really weird rule where pretty much the top 2 makes it, but anybody that got more than 12.5% of the registered voters will make it as well. So they call it like triangulaire, right? Like a triangulation. And so this can be pretty unpredictable, right? And so you have a lot of those seats where, if it was left versus right, what it would, but all of a sudden it's right versus left, and so now the left can win. So and a lot of time the far right, that's the only way they could win seats. They're like, well, we need both a left and a right candidate to make it, so that they split the the non-far right vote, and we make it with like 35-40%. When they actually there was only one of them, then we need 50+1, and pretty much nobody from the other side would vote for us. At least until 2017, that was the case. So the more three-way race, the better it is for the far right.
You're describing a very fun model to build. This is maybe I shouldn't have said I was going to build. No, we're going to do it. It's going to be fun. But yeah, that's it sounds like a lot of fun. Definitely not frustrating at all. No. Thank you, Bryan, for coming on today, for talking to us about France and about Canada. You can find him on Twitter at Too Close to Call. Go ahead and give him a follow. Also, thank you, Alex, for coming on today. You can follow him at Twitter at Constituan. It's spelled exactly as it's pronounced. And also Curtis was on today as well. You can follow him at Polling Canada, at Polling USA, at Polling USA, at Polling Australasia. All the pollings, you can find him there. Thank you, everybody, and have a good night.
Thanks, guys. Have a good night.